Okay, good morning still, isn't it? Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. And thanks indeed to the organisers, and in particular to Sue and Kiyoshi for the invitation to speak to you today, and to Donald for that introduction. I should like to begin with a song. Not by me, though.
I am with you, wandering through memory lane, living the years, laughter and tears over again. I am dreaming yet of the night we met, when life was a lovely refrain. You were so shy, saying goodbye there in the dawn. Only a glance full of romance, and you were gone. Though my dreams are in vain, my love will remain. Strolling again, memory lane with you.
So that was Irving Kaufmans' Memory Lane from 1924. You can find that on the internet if you want to listen to the whole thing. Memory, scholars assent, is spatial. Let us close our eyes, proposes Maurice Halbwachs, and turning within ourselves, go back along the course of time to the furthest point at which our thought still holds clear remembrances of scenes and people. Never do we go outside space. Fellow French thinker Paul Ricoeur agrees. Things remembered are intrinsically associated with places, he notes, and it is not by chance that we say of what has occurred that it took place. Indeed, such is the accepted symbiosis between reminiscence and space, that in English the phrase memory lane is a commonplace for thinking about the past. I am with you wandering through memory lane, croons Irving on the song just played. Living the years, laughter and tears over again. As my lecture today will elaborate, Kaufman's twin expressions of joy and sorrow are often equally apt in assessing the topic of memory and the city. So my aim this morning is to examine the processes by which some aspects of the past are physically and emotionally inscribed into the urban landscape, while others are overlooked or forgotten. In offering pathways, methodologies and case studies for understanding memory and the modern city, my talk ranges across international city settings on 5 continents. More trans-urban than transnational in approach, the analysis is premised on the utility of the comparative project, as described in contemporary writing on cities. So it is that in recent years, historians including Andrew Brownmay, Nicholas Kenny and Rebecca Maginn have enhanced the intellectual rationale for comparing city settings, be they precincts within cities considered similar or cities markedly different in scale or in function. This lecture turns to such localized locations to take in urban memories, both built and intangible, memories shared and memories contested, memories performed and memories lost. In order to evaluate urban memory, we need first to think about how we perceive the city as an entity. Here I want to speak to the notion of the city as a palimpsest. A palimpsest is a multi-layered written record, an object of accretion that still bears traces of its earlier form. One of the first scholars to propose reading urban space in this way was historian and archivist Geoffrey Martin, whose words are on screen. Martin's references to blemishes and words beneath words are important. The evidence of the past in cities is always overwritten, smudged and partly erased. The layout of streets and lanes can provide an enduring framework, sometimes lasting centuries, even as the buildings around them are replaced. But such configurations are also vulnerable. Reading memory at the surface of the city is hence only a first stage, albeit an important one. And it's also worth noting Andreas Huyssen's argument that although the notion of the palimpsest is tied to writing, the texts with which those researching urban memory are concerned are both literary and built. Or, put another way, in the phrasing of author Italo Calvino, the city must never be confused with the words that describe it, and yet between the one and the other there is a connection. It's sometimes said that the past lies buried in the present, or that the past is not really the past at all. And unexpected finds can lay this point bare. After a large-scale demolition of buildings in the Rocks district of Sydney, an archaeological dig in 1994 revealed the former dwelling places and possessions of convict labourers brought to the infant colony from the late 1780s. The youth hostel that now sits atop the dig rather wonderfully makes a virtue out of this once buried history by presenting arriving backpackers with displayed finds and information panels on fragments of a lost neighbourhood. Similarly, more recently, a number of mass graves, some associated with the Black Death of the 14th century, others with the later Bethlehem or Bedlam Asylum, have been discovered by the recent tunnelling beneath London to create the Crossrail train link, once again keeping archaeologists busy documenting thousands of remnants and arranging public exhibitions. The analogy of the palimpsest, however, entails something more than the rediscovery of old bones and quotidian treasures lurking beneath or behind. If urban memories resemble layered scripts, those scripts also reference each other. Ricoeur suggests that each new building is inscribed in urban space, like a narrative within a setting of intertextuality. Urban palimpsests of memory run beneath ground as well as behind facades. They're subject to alterations through time and operate in often competing and crowded sets of recollections. Thick with history, we might surmise, cities also play host to dense, interconnected, and shifting layers of memory. A number of cities figure especially prominently in recent scholarly understandings of memory in the city, and it's worth calling in on two before opening out into a more thematic analysis. Hiroshima and New York have each witnessed shattering upheavals in the 20th and 21st centuries, with both cities serving subsequently as prisms through which global debates about history and memory are refracted. As is very well known, on the morning of the 6th of August 1945, the first atomic bomb used as a weapon of war fell on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Cataclysmic damage resulted. At least 80,000 people were killed instantly, and some 62,000 of the 90,000 buildings in the city were destroyed. As the dust cleared, up to 5 square miles of the city centre lay in ruins. Such bald figures, of course, are mere approximations of an event which continued to unfold years later as city dwellers succumbed to radiation sickness, as damaged buildings collapsed or were torn down, and as debate raged about how to rebuild. In the aftermath of the attack on their city, Hiroshima's survivors harboured what historian Lisa Yanyama calls dark memories. In this context, decisions regarding what to do with the skeletal frames of ruined buildings and the harrowing sites of medical treatment became contested matters. While some of the hibakusha, the Japanese collective noun for survivors of the atomic bombing, welcomed the preservation of key locations, others wished not to confront sites of horror as they continued their lives. As a case in point, the remains of the former exhibition hall, now dubbed the A-bomb dome, elicited painful flashbacks for many city dwellers during the period of post-war reconstruction. Saved from demolition through the fostering of consensus and reinforced now by added steel, This edifice stands amidst a peace memorial park. According to Yanayama, the preservation of the building and the creation of the park around it served to tame memories of the building and of the bombing that had preceded it. So it was then that by hiving off just a small portion of the city for intense reflection, surrounding neighbourhoods, many left equally desolate by the bomb, could hence regenerate without such permanent reminders. People built this city to forget, observed a journalist visiting in 1962. The park itself continues to be an extraordinary place for perceiving memorial culture. Over 50 sites of commemoration dot the landscape, including among them a memorial cenotaph, which houses in a coffin-like object the names of all of those who perished, a circular memorial mound containing the ashes of up to 70,000 unidentified dead, and a children's peace monument unveiled in 1958, festooned with folded paper cranes in memory of 12-year-old origami practitioner Sadako Sasaki, killed by radiation poisoning in October 1955. The significance of this site for what historian Ran Zwigenberg calls global memory culture is attested by the granting of World Heritage status to this location in 1996, as well, one might add, as by the necessity for off-site storage of the countless thousands of paper cranes sent into the city from around the world for intended display. The presence of the past is felt keenly in other ways too. Volunteers, some of them hibakusha and their descendants, offer readings of oral history survivor accounts to visitors and teach overseas tourists the art of folding paper cranes. Zwigenberg finds the Peace Park and associated museum to be constrained, perhaps even too calm, given the destruction visited upon the city and the continued threat of nuclear war. Arguably, though, it's the contrast between contemporary tranquility and abiding trauma that makes visiting the Peace Park all the more powerful. Attesting to the enduring complexities of changing attitudes regarding the nuclear attack, only recently, in 2008 and 2016, have high-ranking American politicians been invited into this memorial space for organised commemorations. Our second Prism city takes us in turn to a second continent. New York has long showcased a particularly rich memory infrastructure. Waves of immigrants have left their mark and been remembered. Buildings and memorial representations flag local concerns as well as national milestones. But a survey of all of this is not my purpose here today. Instead, it's to the effects of a dual intrusion into the fabric of New York, and Manhattan in particular, that I turn my attention. The deliberate collision of two passenger airliners with the twin towers of the city's World Trade Center on the 11th of September 2001 is an event of such significance that it generated its own shorthand name, 9/11, as well as a military conflict and a period of agonized debate about how best to remember the victims. Unlike the example of Hiroshima, discussions about potential means of public memorialization were held while recollections were still very raw. The challenge was how to reconcile the desire to reuse a prized piece of real estate in Lower Manhattan with the need to commemorate the dead and to memorialize a portentous historical event. But such large-scale concerns mattered little in the immediate aftermath of the attacks. Even as underground fires on the site continued to send plumes of smoke up and across the New York skyline, city dwellers created their own vernacular memorials, partly in the hope of eliciting information about missing loved ones, partly as commemorative acts in the absence of recovered bodies. Around boundary fencing, in the weeks after the destruction, one could observe clusters of homemade memorial objects, such as painted tiles, photographs and drawings. The perimeter also carried thousands of inked messages, turning what was intended as a barrier into a collective project of remembrance and grieving, and simultaneously initiating a heritage site. Some memorials recorded individual lives, Others expressed ideas transcending national concerns and suggested that Ground Zero, as it became known, was a global memory place. The question of what to do with the site itself remained. Architect Daniel Libeskind, famous for his work in Berlin, assumed responsibility as master planner amidst considerable public rancour. His original designs, as sketched here, referenced memory in multiple ways. A new Freedom Tower was to top out at 1,776 feet, the number matching the date of the American Declaration of Independence. The original footprints of the Twin Towers were to remain visible. Surrounding buildings would echo the upward sweep of the Statue of Liberty, casting no shadows over the site. Little remains of Liebeskind's detailed vision on site today, though two significant aspects of his memory foundations plan persisted. A new skyscraper, One World Trade Center, retains the height originally envisaged, and the footprints of the Twin Towers survive as memorial spaces. Emanating from 63 nations, some 5,201 submissions were received for the design of these spaces, and this is a real treasure trove of contemporary and global responses to memorialization. Michael Arrod's winning entry, open to the public in September 2011, features cascading waterfalls and the names of the deceased cut into metal sheets flanking square pools. As in Hiroshima, the presence of absence is again prevalent. An attempt to express the inexpressible, notes historian Kay Ferrers. The trope of the void stands for unintelligibility as much as for loss. Deciduous trees planted nearby, including a surviving pear tree from the original World Trade Center site, soften the memorial precinct and are intended to signify regeneration and rebirth. Voids, absences, suffering, renewal. It would seem that Hiroshima and New York each foreground the idea of memory as trauma. Trauma to which contemplative spaces aim to confer a form of therapy. With post-9/11 books on memory in the city bearing such titles as Wounded Cities, Traumascapes Among the Dead Cities, and Heritage That Hurts, it can be tempting to conflate urban memory with an inventory of horrors. But this would be short-sighted, unduly limiting the role of human agency. Memory, Huyssen implores, whether individual or generational, political or public, is always more than only the prison house of the past. And so it is, I think, that a more thematic approach allows us to explore agency in greater detail. And so I'm going to move on to that now. Mention monuments as a category of analysis, and thoughts might turn towards ruins like the A-bomb dome. But most likely, one will think first of statues. These are ossified or frozen history, representing deliberate efforts to stop time. French historian Pierre Nora famously conceived such objects as lieux de mémoire, sites of memory, which aimed to trigger recollections. Importantly, Nora argued that such encouragements to remember blossomed in France at a time when the collective context of memory in modern society, the milieu de mémoire, was declining. Statues and monuments, of course, are mere metonyms for broader understandings of the individuals and causes they represent, though their existence and the intentions behind them can provide insights into historical preoccupations. Power dynamics surround the construction of statuary, and these forces warrant examination too. Public monuments do not arise as if by natural law to celebrate the deserving, argues Kirk Savage. They are built by people with sufficient power to marshal or impose public consent for their erection. When regimes change and relations of power alter, statues can serve as awkward reminders of a past many people would rather forget. Note here Coronation Park in Delhi, for instance, which houses a diminishing gallery of notables associated with the British Raj, relocated there in the 1960s and recently broken up, or the treatment accorded to statues of Lenin in cities like Vilnius since the sweeping political changes of the early 1990s. Written in stone these figures may have been, but initial prominence does not necessarily entail permanent survival. Aside from cohering around prominent statues and monuments, memory operates in the city in much more subtle ways. Scholars who pursue semiology, the study of signs and symbols broadly defined, most famously as advocated by Roland Barthes, have helped initiate alternative ways of reading city spaces. Such signs can say much about the relationship of memory and history for those who care to notice. Street names, for instance, often signify people considered notable, or else record for intended posterity events, activities, or places. In Australia, the suburb of St Kilda in the city of Melbourne, appellations bearing Scottish and English origins respectively, plays host to a raft of Ukrainian-inspired street names. Within a relatively compact area of land, many designations reference the Crimean War, including among them Inkerman Street, Odessa Street, Sebastopol Street, Cardigan Street, and Nightingale Street. The aftermath of battle coincided with suburban expansion in this bayside suburb, and colonial loyalists looked to recent history for inspiration. Indeed, in settler societies such as Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, one can find an abundance of names taken from elsewhere and intended to offer a sense of rootedness in a European past. Indigenous place names were also commonly adopted for smaller districts and towns, albeit in frequently altered or misspelled formulations. So we might think about the city of Perth in this regard, and the suburbs of Cardup and Yangebup, each word a mishearing of local Aboriginal names for particular flora and fauna. The ultimate indication of the power of urban planning is revealed when shifting historical contexts prompt whole cities to be retitled. Hence Salisbury's naming as Harare, capital of Zimbabwe in 1982, the transformation of French colonial Saigon into communist Ho Chi Minh City in 1976, or St. Petersburg's evolution from its earlier titles of Leningrad and Petrograd. India alone also contains dozens of examples for the post-independence period. So within the carefully named streets of deliberately named suburbs of purposefully named cities, one can also sometimes find heritage walking routes, another form of signified history. Boston in America hence has its revolutionary Freedom Trail, featuring plaques mounted in the footpath to aid navigation and to indicate waypoints. In London and other British towns and cities, blue information plaques mounted on walls are a common sight, scattered across city centres and suburbs to indicate the dwelling places of people considered eminent, or the location of events regarded as foundational. There's a big contest over these, but I won't go into that now. The attribution scheme, currently overseen by English Heritage, stretches back to 1866. But urban epitaphs can also be less prominent. Park benches, for example, denote often touching personal memories of lives led and absences felt. By June 2016, some 4,223 memorial plates, each with stories to tell and benefactors to pay for them, could be found affixed to benches in New York's Central Park alone. And we can see some examples of that here from a New York Times story. As with gravestones in cemeteries, the inscriptions operate at different levels. Their effective power is clearly heightened for acquaintances and loved ones, and not necessarily noticed by others. Weathering or neglect can take their toll too. Be they personal or public, memorials need tending to remain legible. So-called vernacular memorials might be more ephemeral still, encompassing flowers and cards taped to a lamppost to commemorate a tragic road death, as we see here, white spray-painted ghost bicycles at the scenes of fatal collisions, or the love locks attached to fencing or railings to signify relationships. They actually go back to the First World War in Serbia, which I found out, was quite surprised that it was that long. Okay. Signified urban memory can be accidental as well, constituting unintentional monuments in one helpful categorization. Examples of the latter we see here: faded shop signs recording former trades, abandoned or repurposed industrial buildings, sometimes retaining in name a former activity, outdated graffiti bearing political slogans, or old bill posters for events now past. One select group of intrepid urban explorers, namely psychogeographers, take special delight in recording such traces, sometimes relating them to their own recollections of earlier years in the same neighbourhoods. Following their lead, rather than studying memorials in isolation, it can be especially helpful to study landscapes of different types of commemoration across city spaces. And as ever, it's always important to ponder the memorial signs not permitted or seen. In Belleville, in France, for instance, no street names recall the radical weeks and bloody end of the Paris Commune of 1871, nor is the important role of the neighbourhood's municipal building marked in any way at the site. Absences and erasures can be accidental or deliberate, one can conclude. City texts of history and memory, I'm arguing, do not write themselves. Performances of memory. Intended fixity characterises the formulations of urban memory assessed so far. Civic performances showcase a different aspect: memory on the move via processions or parades through the streets, pageants and theme parks conveying versions of the past, or personal provocations for reflection amidst the bustle of city life. In terms of prevalence, scholars agree that grand-scale public commemorations reached a high point in Europe, the United States and Australasia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, during an era of heightened nationalism. Watch out for those Vikings. Performances of memory can also take us to recreated streets bounded by ticket booths and gift shops. So-called living history museums are commonly focused on urban themes. On the outskirts of Nikko in Japan, for instance, sightseers can step back in time at Edo Wonderland, taking in a recreated market, swordsmiths and courtesan procession. While at Sovereign Hill in the city of Ballarat, the Australian gold rush of the 1850s is brought to life by costumed activators, as they're called, venturing up and down a represented main street or guiding visitors through recreations of underground mine workings. Such experiences help fulfill what historian Raphael Samuel calls the quest for immediacy, the search for a past which is palpably and visibly present. That many more people engage with the past in this way than through studiously footnoted library books and other means of academic dissemination is a cause for consternation and indeed annoyance among some professional historians, with debate flaring intermittently regarding the authenticity of living history attractions. Real, quote-unquote, period buildings can lend a sense of reality, it is argued, but the complexities and inequalities of urban living are usually overlooked. Academic historians can hence be sniffy about what many perceive as a sanitized version of an unchanging past. And yet, as Samuel continues, the practice and ambition of living history actually corresponds with several scholarly aims, not least the desire to give voice to the dead, to make flesh and blood figures out of fragments. Historians similarly dramatize evidence, he observes, offering choreographed versions of the past using a cast of characters that they themselves select. The performances of the past showcased in processions, pageants and historical theme parks are ephemeral. Parades pass by, and entry to historical theme parks is time limited, pun intended. More fleeting still is a final category of performed memories: pop-up enactments. Coinciding with the centenary of the First World War, for instance, the "We're Here Because We're Here" project garnered very substantial public attention in 2016. On the 1st of July that year, 100 years on from the first day of the Battle of the Somme, some 1,400 volunteers, dressed in reproduced military uniforms, appeared unannounced across the UK, as we see here, clustering together in shopping centres, car parks and train stations. Periodically breaking out into song, "We're Here Because We're Here" was a caustic refrain in the trenches, the volunteers marched or stood in silence, boarded trains, including the Underground, and when approached handed out small cards detailing the particulars of one of the almost 20,000 British soldiers killed in France on a single day in 1916. "Most memorials you have to go to," explained Jeremy Deller, the artist behind the performance piece. "This is a memorial that will actually come to you just when you're not expecting it." While town cities and centres provided the most prominent settings for Deller's pop-up commemorations, "We're Here Because We're Here" was not solely focused on urban memory. But other artists tackled this theme more directly. As a case in point, a number of photographers have been prompted to produce documentary interventions by the relentless demolition and construction within Chinese cities since the 1990s. In Chen Xiaosheng's 1997 Street series, for example, three-dimensional photo collages of Guangzhou are held by the artist in front of matching locations around the city. It takes a while to get your eye in with this image, but you'll if you start at the bottom, it starts to make more sense. And then they're photographed there for posterity to show the difference in just a few months. "The task is hopeless," admits the artist. "I feel that the speed at which I photograph the streets will never catch up with the speed at which the streets are changing. For this reason, I don't dare leave Guangzhou for long." That real sense of change. Let's move on to our final category, intangible urban memory. Actually, it's my penultimate category. I've overpromised. Sorry about that. And in this one, I want to foreground very personal engagements with city spaces. Something intangible, of course, is something without physical presence. It might be sincerely felt, yet not seen, sensed by some, but missed by others. Intangible urban memory is loosely related to intangible cultural heritage, defined by the UN as encompassing aspects including oral traditions, repeated social practices, rituals, and transmitted knowledge, but differs in not necessitating community recognition or sustained cultivation. Intangible urban memory might instead be solely individual, reminiscences of an absent friend in a particular location, for instance, or recollections of personal triumphs and misfortunes triggered by return in thought or person to the site of a former school, workplace, or lodging. Such personal connections can apply anywhere and to anyone. They are also likely to be deeply felt. The notion of intangible urban memory, then, opens the city to everyone as an intimate memorial space, or perhaps more accurately, to the city as a jumbled mosaic of overlapping memories attached to particular places that harbour meaning. But how can historians seek to understand this endlessly rich assortment? Well, a number of research strategies have been deployed to bring to light what is usually discreet or hidden. Autobiographical accounts of urban living in times past have been scrutinised. For example, their findings regarding remembered sites of significance read alongside diaries, semi-autobiographical novels, and other so-called ego texts, like surviving letters. For contemporary history, scholars have also interviewed city dwellers, sometimes asking them to sketch out on paper places of personal attachment. Kevin Lynch's The Image of the City, first published in 1960, was pioneering in this regard, hosting within its pages composite drawings of Boston, Jersey City, and LA as remembered by residents. He later extended the exercise, this time publishing the drawings of individual interviewees, many of them adolescents, for 5 global cities. And more recently again, Carla Pascoe's Spaces Imagined, Places Remembered, extends Lynch's chronological scope, marrying analysis of 21st century drawings of recollected 1950s Melbourne with insights from detailed oral history interviews. That final category. In her celebrated 1995 book, The Power of Place, Urban Landscapes as Public History, historian of the United States Dolores Hayden asked a direct question. Where are the Native American, African American, Latino, and Asian American landmarks? For over 2 decades now, those concerned with urban memory across the world have been grappling with the implications of this urgent query. A diversity of strategies has resulted. Lobby groups have sought to raise new memorials, students have led demands for icons of earlier eras to be torn down, and historians have helped compose fresh information panels for monuments regarded, albeit rarely universally, as problematic. Pioneering research has also yielded new accounts of historically disenfranchised groups. Competing in already crowded bookshops and city squares, such activities are intersectional because they overlap with and cut across other forms of memory making, often acknowledging the multiplicity of historical identities attached to places and to people. And just in this final section, I'm going to focus on indigeneity as an example of this. The public recognition of indigenous histories that have both predated and endured the establishment of settler colonial cities has been regarded as particularly pressing since the turn of the century. As post-colonial Latin Americanist Gustavo Verdecio comments, the histories of indigenous pasts are often invisible at a glance, disguised by dominant Western regimes of seeing the landscape. For the Native American and First Nations territories of North America, historian Cole Thrush is among a growing group of scholars helping to make manifest the true nature of the suppressed and the hidden through painstaking research, including partnerships with local indigenous communities. In native Seattle, Thrush assesses a city that would, on first encounter, seem to buck a trend. Seattle, he observes, has long emphasized its Native American history via totem poles, festivals, naming practices, and the motifs of urban infrastructure. But, he argues further, such recognition has commonly served only to marginalize Native Americans as passive, metaphorical, anti-urban, and lost to the march of time. As in North America, so in Australia and South Africa, among cities thick with memorials to settler colonial endeavour are but few connecting in meaningful ways to pre- or post-contact indigenous histories. Occlusions are manifold. Canberra's National War Memorial, for instance, acknowledges indigenous soldiers who served Australia and the British Empire in global conflicts, but overlooks those indigenous warriors who fought the white invaders during Australia's frontier wars. We see here a protest related to that in 2011. In post-apartheid South Africa, by contrast, the gargantuan Voortrekker monument on the outskirts of Pretoria presents similar paradoxes. Built between 1937 and 49, the monument honours the memory of the Great Trek, in which white South Africans colonised interior lands in the early 19th century. Given its celebratory Afrikaner symbolism, and advance apologies for the racial depictions on this next slide, and fearing its potential demolition under the imminent rule of Nelson Mandela, Afrikaner cultural organisations privatised the structure in the early 1990s to protect it. This turned an object announcing national significance into something more parochial, argues historian Albert Grunling, effectively shrinking its representational power. While many black and indeed many white South Africans still find the monument highly insensitive and historically flawed, the declaration of black singer Abigail Kubeka performing at the site in the year 2000 that, and I quote, "the last inch of the country is now part of the nation," did serve to alter perceptions. A new Freedom Park, telling an alternative history of the South African nation, now stands directly across the road from the Voortrekker monument, further reducing that monument's political voltage. To the southwest, in Cape Town, a statue of British colonialist Cecil Rhodes was removed in April 2015 from the campus of the city's main university following prolonged student protests. Legacies linger, however, and across cities connected to fallen regimes, history in public remains especially hotly contested. Artistic interventions constitute an alternative form of speaking back to the absence of bricks and mortar memorials honouring non-white individuals and groups, or else to monuments portraying only indigenous loss instead of agency. Spray can slogans or sanctioned projections, like the now nightly illumination with indigenous art of Sydney Opera House, represent one type of response, personal performances another. Talton Nation artist Peter Morin's cultural graffiti project, for instance, witnessed Morin transport First Nations songs from present-day Canada to London's monuments in 2013, singing indigenous spiritual meaning into the surfaces of stones regarded as living embodiments of colonial power. Without similar care, however, performances of memory can prove short-sighted. In Melbourne, for example, an apartment block that bears across the balconies of its 32 stories the face of Wurundjeri elder and emissary William Barak has been criticised for its location, on the site of a former brewery, its associations, luxury dwellings for sale in the context of indigenous land rights struggles, and its superficiality. For art historian David Hanson, the portrait building, as it's known, uses the patina of Aboriginality to mask motives of profit, glossing over, and I quote, the painful truth of Indigenous and settler history. Despite some similar reservations, historian Christine Hanson is more generous, deeming the building a poetic and welcome intervention in the cityscape, reminding Melburnians of meanings that underpin the contemporary fabric of metropolitan sprawl. Fittingly, Hanson's views featured in an online culture journal inviting public responses and titled The Conversation. Whether loved or loathed, the building has certainly inspired dialogue, and perhaps such debate is a first step towards a fuller appreciation of the city's long history. In The Power of Place, with which I began this section, Hayden called for a more socially inclusive urban history. Recognising that cities host many coexisting sites, indeed landscapes of significance, and that addressing shared meanings through understanding multiple intersections of the past offered a fruitful strategy, Hayden's first concerns were for broader appreciations of race and space, as well as the gendered and classed patterns of urban memory. Scholars and campaigners have amplified and extended this remit in recent years, widening out to encompass an expanding range of social demarcations, such as age and sexuality. There is still much to discover and a very great deal to learn. What makes an intersectional approach so alluring for scholars of memory in the city is that it promises radical new perspectives tied to the distant past, as well as to the always changing present moment. I really like this memorial. This could be a place of historical importance. Such an approach, moreover, tethers research unashamedly to activism, recognising that subjectivities cannot be ignored. By embracing specific urban settings, neighbourhoods, and even whole cities as objects of study, more socially encompassing and hence ultimately more honest histories continue to emerge. My last paragraph. Densely populated, we can conclude, cities are also thickly inhabited by memories. As this talk has hopefully demonstrated, cities across the world are much more than mere mausoleums, graveyards for lives once led. Memory in the city can be fleet of foot as well as cast in stone, celebratory as well as sorrowful, contested as well as consensual. Once one knows how to look and what types of sources to examine, cities become ever more fascinating places for perceiving memorial culture. Here, the personal jostles with the communal, and the national inflects the global. Across diverse metropolitan landscapes, nothing is ever fully settled, and the process of inscription is open to all. Human memory is both heightened and endangered in the urban landscape, surmises public historian Eric Sandweiss. Etched into their hardened fabrics of brick and stone, records of human interaction mark cities as sites of endurance, as well as of change. As historians of urban memory, our task is part recovery and preservation, and part decoding and analysis. Through these activities, we can seek to know how life was and is understood, and approach both the present and the past on their own terms, ever aware that between these temporalities runs a bustling two-way street. Thank you.